Suicide or murder? That's the question in the case of 23-year-old Sandra Birchmore, whose death 3 years ago was found to be self-inflicted. But now, a world-renowned forensic pathologist says her cause of death was homicide.
There's just certain people in the medical legal community, when their name is mentioned, people are going to sit up and take notice, and Dr. Baden is certainly one of those.
He says the facts in the case just don't add up.
That is an atypical injury that you have in a hanging. That means it does not occur. You have to have sufficient amount of velocity in order to make that bone fracture. And that's what we're looking at here.
But all that is just the beginning.
Feels like a certain level of trust was betrayed, and she was taken advantage of.
There's also allegations that Birchmore was groomed and sexually assaulted by 3 police officers, starting when she was just 13. At the time of her death, she was pregnant, allegedly by one of those officers.
She started on her journey. She was fascinated by police officers. You would expect for that young girl to be protected and shielded in this environment.
All this begs the question, could criminal charges soon be filed?
I think that merely his presence in this case is going to compel the prosecutor, and that's where this needs to start.
It was February 4th, 2021, when 23-year-old Sandra Birchmore was found dead inside her Canton, Massachusetts apartment. At the time, investigators said there were no signs of foul play. Medical examiners with the Massachusetts State Police soon ruled her death a suicide. For years, Birchmore's supporters have been outspoken, saying she didn't end her own life. And now, a major figure in the criminal justice world agrees.
When Dr. Baden walks into a room or his name is mentioned in regards, people, they're going to sit up and take notice very quickly, particularly government officials that are involved in the case, because they know they don't want to tangle with him, because he'll come out and he will make his own diagnosis, and it carries a lot of weight.
That's forensic death investigator Joseph Scott Morgan. We reached out to him about this case to review the findings of Dr. Michael Baden. Dr. Baden has a long history as a forensic pathologist, once serving as the chief medical examiner for New York City. He's also known for his investigations in the deaths of John Belushi, Jeffrey Epstein, and George Floyd. He also investigated the assassinations of both Martin Luther King Jr. and John F. Kennedy and testified in the O.J. Simpson trial. He was hired by Sandra Birchmore's family as part of a civil suit. In his recent findings, Dr. Baden disagrees with her original cause of death. With that in mind, we reached out to Joseph Scott Morgan. So what we're really zeroing in on today is whether this was a homicide or a suicide, because originally a couple years ago when this happened, it was ruled a suicide. Yep. But now we have a major professional saying, I believe it was homicide. So how do you make the determination which manner of death it is?
Well, it all begins at the scene. And when you have an individual that dies at their own hand, and that's the way we define suicide. It's very simple definition. It's death at one's own hand. There are certain distinct things that we look for in hangings. With suicides in our country, the number one cause of death with suicides are firearms. But in my estimation and working cases as I have, the second are actually hangings, because you can make ligatures out of anything. Nooses, that sort of thing, even bed sheets, can be transformed into this. So when you first get to the scene, you want to be able to examine the body. If the body is still suspended when you arrive at the scene, you want to treat it very, very carefully as you begin to remove the body from its position. Very detailed notes have to be taken. Now, sometimes when you show up at scenes, the bodies have already been taken down, and that complicates cases many times. But the big question you have to ask, is this individual physically capable of having done this, of bringing about their own death?
Originally, Massachusetts State Police said there were no signs of physical abuse or a struggle in Birchmore's apartment. They said she killed herself by hanging. Dr. Baden rejects those findings, though, writing, quote, Ms. Birchmore did not die of suicide hanging. The cause of Ms. Birchmore's death is strangulation, and the manner of death is homicide.
We hear about the term hard point a lot. That's come up in Gilgo. When you hear hard point, that means a location where you can secure a ligature or a noose uh, that is going to be supportive of a body. And did it work? And so you have to consider all of that. And then there's certain anatomical features that we're going to be looking for as well. I think, and folks hearing this need to think about this term. And I'll actually love this term. It's called tinting feature, and it's not TINTING like the tint on a window. It's TENTING like a pup tent. And so when a noose is around a neck, it extends up under the jaw and goes up and forms an apex, kind of like if people are familiar with their Greek alphabet, like lambda, like in this position, it comes to an apex and it's supported. It's one of the features that we look for in suicidal hangings. You'll have a groove or furrow, as it's referred to, that goes up, comes to a point. Now, if you are absent that particular furrow, all right, and the person is suspended and there's no associated hemorrhage, then you need to look a little bit closer and you need to see if the ligature is perhaps covering up something else. And let's just say that an individual was strangled with bare hands. This is called throttling. Um, this is going to leave hemorrhage in the neck, but it's going to run more parallel to the shoulder. So someone reaching out, squeezing and choking, and the hemorrhage will be diffuse, like fingers spread out. Okay, and you can actually see this. I've actually seen cases where you'll see what appear to be areas of hemorrhage that kind of look like fingers. You know, where you can see fingers have been on it, and depending upon the amount of pressure that's applied.
According to Dr. Baden, Birchmore would have lost consciousness within seconds after the ligature was put around her neck. He estimates she died within the next few minutes. According to Dr. Baden, multiple clues left behind at the scene point toward a homicide. To start, the ligature around Birchmore's neck was tied to a doorknob. Dr. Baden says that was done to, quote, give the appearance of a suicidal hanging.
Also, if a ligature has been used as a mode of homicide, there will be a furrow, but it'll run parallel to the shoulders like this. So what happens, and we're talking about staged suicides. You begin to think about staging. Some person might think, a perpetrator could think, that if I choke this person out and then hang them afterwards, we won't be able to figure it out.
Dr. Baden also says Birchmore left behind no note and told others she was happy about her pregnancy. Additionally, a piece of the ligature was found in Birchmore's hair. Dr. Baden says this, quote, occurs when there is resistance during homicidal strangulation. And then there's Birchmore's fractured hyoid bone. One of the things that Dr. Michael Baden wrote in his report is a specific mention of the hyoid bone. This is
Mhm.
something I wasn't super familiar with, but apparently it's different in a suicide versus homicide oftentimes when it's broken or
Yeah.
fractured. Can you explain that?
Yeah, sure. Hyoid is, we refer to it as, you'll hear forensic pathologists talk about it as a bird-like structure. And what that means is that it literally has little wings on it. And kind of a little side fact here that's fascinating. The hyoid bone is the only non-articulating bone in the body. That means it doesn't communicate with any other bony feature in the body. Um, its sole purpose is to literally anchor our tongue in the back of our throat. So if people at home can get an idea, if you can find out where this little cartilaginous member is with your trachea right here, the Adam's apple, and you go superior to it, it's going to vary depending upon the person, but let's just say an inch higher. That's where the hyoid actually rests, up in this area. So in order for this to be fractured, and Dr. Biden points this out, Um, it is most common in strangulations. As a matter of fact, really in our history, the only time you see a fractured hyoid relative to a hanging, most of the time, you have to go back in time to think about judicial hangings where the noose is positioned up very, very high and they fall from a height. And that means that they generate a certain amount of velocity. So that, and you hear about the idea of the neck snapping. And yeah, there's a dislocation in judicial hangings of, say, the C1 and C2, which is a critical area. But many times you would find fractured hyoids. But that doesn't happen with most hangings. People don't snap their necks when it's at their own hand. Most people asphyxiate. They don't fall from a significant height in order to generate that kind of velocity in order to and it has the rope has to be or lucha has to be positioned up like this. And how do you access that? Well, I don't want to put words into Dr. Mike's mouth here, but what he is pointing out is the fact that this hyoid was fractured by his view, and that in order to access that, you have to go so high up on the neck. Most of the time, a noose is not going to accomplish that task. It has to be high and constant pressure. And we've heard this, and Dr. Mike has spoken about this extensively relative to Epstein. That is an atypical injury that you have in a hanging. That means it does not occur. You have to have sufficient amount of velocity in order to make that bone fracture. And that's what we're looking at here with her. I think per Dr. Baden, was there a sufficient amount of force that could have been generated, and was the noose positioned in such a way that it would have snapped? Probably unlikely in most of the cases that he's talking about. This homicidal asphyxiation with throttling high up on the neck, pressure, and the little bone will fracture.
Dr. Baden also notes a sexual assault kit was performed after Birchmore died but was never tested. Morgan says that's normal protocol.
Anytime we have a female victim in my field, it's kind of common practice to go ahead and do a sexual assault kit when they die under odd or suspicious circumstances. It's better to have done it and not need it, right? Because once the body is uh, taken care of by a funeral home in whatever manner, you've lost that opportunity. So you have to do it at that moment in time.
We may not have the results of the sexual assault kit right now, but it's not too late.
We've had a horrible track record in this country with sexual assault kits where they've been shelved and that sort of thing. And my biggest concern, I think, if if they did in fact do a sexual assault kit on her, which is going to be swabs and probably nail scrapings and nail clippings, and also hair sampling. Um, what's the status of storage on that? Because you're talking about biological evidence um, that would be indwelling there, and it can be very fragile. So I would hope that that would be pushed forward. I'm encouraged by the fact that they actually did a kit. It's just that apparently it hasn't been analyzed. And there's certain features that we look for physically on the female body to see if there's evidence of sexual assault that had taken place. My suspicion is that they didn't see anything like that at that particular time, but they went ahead and did the kit.
Let's take a quick break from the story of Sandra Birchmore to talk about something important: who you surround yourself with. That's where the sponsor of this story comes in, truthfinder.com. Here's how it works. Go on their website, truthfinder.com, and say, for instance, you have a new neighbor. Let's say I'm your new neighbor. So you type in my name, and within minutes, you get access to reports that include things like numbers, addresses, but also any previous arrests and criminal convictions. And this goes without saying, but my Truthfinder record is sparkling clean. So right now, you can get 50% off confidential background reports at truthfinder.com/lcnews and access information on almost anyone. And then there's the question surrounding Birchmore's pregnancy. There's also allegations that one of these officers, there are three that are accused of having sexually assaulted her,
Mhm.
but apparently one is alleged to be the father of her baby. She was 3 months pregnant at the time she died. Now we're years past when she died. Is it too late to go back and figure out who exactly was the father?
No. In most cases, we do at autopsy what's referred to as a blood card. A blood card is you take a sampling um, from uh, uh, from the victim, and it's placed onto literally a little card, and it's stowed at that point in time, and it would be kept on file. Now, when you have, I believe her number was 3 months. She was 3 months along. She was at probably the end, obviously the end of the first trimester. What type of samples did they take from the fetus? And that would be significant here as well. I don't know. I don't know uh, how much data they could have retrieved from that fetus in order to facilitate that for genetic testing. But there would probably be some. The trick here is what samples did they take and how were they preserved?
Before she died, Birchmore told her friends the identity of her baby's father, former police officer Matthew Farwell. He's also believed to be the last person to see Birchmore alive. Security camera video from her apartment shows Birchmore arrive home at 5:46 p.m. on February 1st. 4 hours later, Matthew Farwell arrives at 9:27 p.m. the same day. He's seen entering through the main door and then going up the elevator. Just minutes later, at 9:56 p.m., he can be seen leaving. Farwell's wife gave birth to a baby boy the very next day, and Birchmore's body was found 2 days after that. Farwell later told Mass State Police troopers that he visited Birchmore that night to tell her things were over between them and that he was blocking her from all forms of communication. He denies any wrongdoing. But those aren't the only allegations against him. In fact, those date back to 2011 when Birchmore was just 13 years old. She was part of the Stoughton Police Department's Explorers program. It works to give kids an inside look at the criminal justice system and provide them mentoring from hands-on experience with officers. It was through this program that Birchmore got connected with Matthew Farwell, his twin brother William Farwell, and another officer, Robert Devine. The officers allegedly began grooming Birchmore when she was only 13. Matthew Farwell is accused of sexually assaulting Birchmore when she turned 15. At the time, he was 27. An investigation later found hundreds of explicit texts between he and Birchmore over the span of multiple years. Investigators also found explicit texts from his twin brother William Farwell sent to Birchmore as well. Both Devine and Matthew Farwell are accused of having sex with Birchmore in their patrol cars. All three men have denied these allegations, but resigned from the Stoughton Police Department in 2022.
The thing about when you're around police officers, they are they should be, kind of a standard that everybody looks up to, that esteems to want to be, in a perfect world. And unfortunately, when you look at these circumstances where you have allegedly a young woman, very young, as a matter of fact, when she started on her journey, she was fascinated by police officers. You would expect for that young girl to be protected and shielded in this environment. And it really, the case itself, it feels like a certain level of trust was betrayed, and she was taken advantage of. From at least that's what we're reading and that's what we're hearing, and it's very sad, very very sad. And the fact that she essentially lost her life. Um, Whether or not it was at her hands or the hands of another, even kind of puts a big exclamation point on the end of that statement, I think.
In 2022, Birchmore's family filed civil suit against the Farwells and Devine, writing they, quote, undertook to engage in inappropriate relationships with Birchmore, who was a minor when the sexual relationships were initiated, abusing her trust and adoration of law enforcement, which, through their inappropriate and undue influence, ultimately led her to allegedly take her own life. The same year, the Stoughton Police Department released the results of an internal investigation. According to Police Chief Donna McNamara, the report showed, quote, horrific injustices, including grooming and sexual abuse inflicted upon Sandra Birchmore at the hands of one rogue and corrupt former police officer, and additional inappropriate sexual relationships by other former police officers.
Well, it's that's something I think relative to the culture of the department that they would want to really do a deep dive on. And you have to go back a few years now, who populated the staff at that particular time. Was she exposed to any kind of inappropriate behavior, or was she in contact um, with individuals that might have a history of this sort of thing? Um, and I think the most chilling thing to me is that if this was facilitated for a 15-year-old to come and uh, be at the station, my question is, are there any others? And that's what kind of really catches catches my eye here, because when a case like this comes out or bubbles up to the surface, it can go one of two ways many times. You'll have people that'll be pretenders that will say, "Yeah, this happened to me," and it turns out that it didn't happen because they're looking for a payday, maybe. But then you'll have that one small voice that's out there that says, finally, somebody else has brought notice to this. This is what happened to me. This is my story. So I would anticipate that you will probably hear potentially from other people. The trick is, as an investigator, how do you vet all of that and separate that out? Because there can be a lot of chatter in the news about that sort of thing. If another person comes forward, I'd be looking for that, because generally, where you have one event like this, you're going to have more than one victim, and so that's going to be quite interesting to watch as this case develops.
When it comes to Dr. Baden's recent findings, Chief McNamara says she was profoundly disturbed by the report, but notes that Birchmore died in Canton, meaning Stoughton police don't have jurisdiction to investigate. But Dr. Baden's name alone could mean others investigate. Dr. Baden is very well respected. He's highly decorated. He has participated in some of the most intense cases that we've seen across the country. So when his name is thrown around, people are taking a closer look for sure. So do you think it's possible then that charges could be brought in this case based on his recent findings?
I think that merely his presence in this case is going to compel the prosecutor, and that's where this needs to start, to do a deep dive with all of the parties involved in this, to look back in time. Let's just say that this turns out not to be a homicide. The just the implication of this in the law enforcement community, just this taint that would be um, upon their image, requires that this be thoroughly investigated, and that it's open, that people know that their police are not corrupted in any way. And I think that the authorities running the police department would want that as well. They would invite that in. So, and that again, going back to Dr. Baden and his reputation, that's one of the times, or one of the things that causes that switch to be flipped when his name is mentioned, and you know that he's looking at this. There's just certain people in the medical legal community, when their name is mentioned, people are going to sit up and take notice. And um, Dr. Baden is certainly one of those.
In the end, Morgan says Dr. Baden's report holds some major weight in this case. When you are looking at the report that Dr. Baden brought forward, are you thinking the same thing, that this could have been homicide rather than suicide based on the facts?
Well, yeah, I think that there's certainly enough information that it needs to be probed at this point in time. And then, given all of the circumstantial, the storm that this has created, it's something that's going to require a long look. But on the flip side of that, it's very important that all of this data that should have started at the scene, um, relative to her mental health history and relative to any previous attempts, if there were any kind of vocalization that she had done about being depressed or anything, all of that has to be factored in. And given Dr. Baden's expertise, I can only assume that that has crossed his desk and he's viewed all of this, and then take that circumstantial data or the absence thereof and factor that in with what he's physically seeing. This demands that the police take a deeper look at this.
Just this year, the Peace Officers and Training Commission added Matthew Farwell to a national database for law enforcement accountability. He's also barred from working as a cop in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Commission proceedings in the cases of William Farwell and Robert Devine are still pending. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sandra Gillespie.